Hi again. This is the last video on class, and we're going to talk about Pierre Bourdieu. And to help us do that, we have my dear colleague Sarah Attfield. But before I throw to Sarah, I just want to tell you a little bit of background about Bourdieu. So he, unlike Wright, is not still with us, but he is a contemporary theorist nonetheless. He's a French sociologist, and when he was looking at class, he saw that indeed there's been more class mobility than there would have been during the Industrial Revolution, for example. But he said that class mobility has mainly been between working class and middle class, or within some of those different layers of the middle class. And he saw that actually the upper class, the capitalists or bourgeoisie, that boundary has remained remarkably stable. There has been actually very, very little movement into or out of that very elite class. And he wondered why. And he looked at the economic changes over a century and a half, 2 centuries, and he thought economics just doesn't explain this. There's something else going on. So people, middle classes in particular, are earning more money, and we've been talking about the haul pack driver who can earn quite a lot of money, but they're just not cracking it into the elite class. So he started to think differently in 2 ways. One is that he said we need to think about capital as not only economic capital, but also as social and cultural capital, that there are different types of capital that we have that we can use and deploy in the world. And that's what Sarah's going to talk to us about in a minute. But before we get to that, the other critical difference that Bourdieu brought into discussions of class was looking not at just our inputs, what we earn and how we earn it, our relationship to the means of production or our competitiveness in the marketplace. He said it's just as much about how we spend our money and spend our recreational time. And you would have all watched, I know, and if you haven't, go do it right after this, the Grayson Perry video that's on UTS online, the exploration of middle class taste. And what Grayson Perry showed there was really distinct differences of taste between the lower middle class, who wanted known brand names, Abercrombie and Fitch, Range Rover, BMW, the McMansions. They wanted all these known brands that were indicators of affluence and success, while the upper middle classes really shunned all those brands, and they would buy a second-hand little curio or something that had a story that they could tell with it. So they could have a dinner party and say, oh yes, you know, this, you know, lovely little ornament, yes, I just fell in love with it. I picked it up. There was a school fete across the road from the farmer's market where I was buying my organic vegetables. And, you know, so they're displaying something really, really different there. So go watch it. He will tell you a great deal. But for Bourdieu, he's really interested. He said things like this are critical if we're going to understand class and inequality and class mobility or immobility, that it's not just our ability to generate a particular income, but also how one spends that income. So why did the upper classes prefer golf and tennis and drink wine, and lower classes drink beer and watch rugby league, for example? So yes, and this is where he really came up with social and cultural capital as being critical determinants of class. So Sarah, what on earth was he talking about? What is social capital?
Well, social capital is the networks and relationships that people form that can be used in an advantageous way. So, for example, if you've gone to a private school, you might build networks and connections with the other students at that private school who later on, when you go out into the world of work, might help you get a job. Or you might have family connections that help you to get a job in this industry that you're interested in. And those kinds of connections are really important because they can be exchanged for economic capital. So it's not just in itself that it's important, that means that you have more opportunities, but those opportunities will lead to also an increased potential in economic capital.
Right, so if my friend's mum works at the ABC, then I might have a better chance of getting that internship there.
That's right, yeah. And so people in the middle and upper classes have more of those networks and relationships with people working in those middle class industries and professions that they want to go into. And so that's why it's harder for working class people to get a foot into those industries. It's something you see in a lot of industries. At the moment, there's a lot of talk about people in the entertainment industries, in that it's much harder for working class people now to become actors and performers and to get those kinds of jobs because of those networks that are kind of closing off to working class people.
So it's not what you know.
It's who you know.
It's who you know.
That's right, that's what social capital really is.
And the old school tie network.
Yes,
and,
yes.
Was it the old boys club and things like that?
That's right. It does work in a weirdly reverse way for working class people as well. And Bourdieu didn't really talk about this, but working class people have their own social capital, but it is within the world of the working class environment. So people might know somebody who's a good plumber, for example, or who can come and do their electrical work. And so they do use those kinds of connections, but they're very much from within that working class world. They don't really sort of go outside of that world.
So your social network, in a sense, it's going to help you get a job or an entry point or friendship within the class that you started in.
That's right, yeah. And so you be able to negotiate through those networks and relationships within that particular class and in that particular field as well. But for working class people, they don't really translate outside of that.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not quite the same as friendship, is it?
No, you don't have to be friends with people who help you get a job.
It can
it's not
also
a requirement.
just be like having a particular school name on your CV.
That's right,
that will kind of show that you're a part of that network.
Yeah, that's right. And for some employers, looking at somebody's CV, and even though the applicants might have pretty much identical qualifications, there's an unconscious class bias often that means that looking at the CV and seeing the elite institution as opposed to maybe the state institution can mean favourable outcome for the person from the elite institution.
It's really interesting you should say that, because there's a law firm in Sydney called Mark Lawyers, and I'll put a link to this article up on UTS and online, but they decided to run a blind selection process for their internships, which are highly sought after. Law's a particularly competitive field. So they asked applicants, or they instructed applicants not to include their name, gender, address, postcode. The only identifying, or they weren't allowed to put what school they went to, nothing. They just had to put their mobile phone number and then make the case based on their skills and their character as to why they should get the job. And Mark Lawyers expected, they were wanting to test really if they had gender and race bias, if they had an unconscious bias to give men more opportunities and to give white people rather than... Anyway, they found that in actual fact they recruited roughly the same number of people according to gender and race, but what they were really surprised by was that they, when they had the blind round, selected many more people from public schools and non-elite universities. So previously most of their recruitment came through particular law schools, and that was the biggest change. So that it shows how unconscious and inbuilt some of that.
It's unconscious, and also people tend to hire people who are like them. So if the people running the firm or the organisation who are mainly middle or upper class, they're more likely to hire those sorts of people because that's what they know. Because people don't necessarily have much contact with each other across classes, so they might not have met working class people and know that working class people can do the job as well as anybody else.
Yes, yes, indeed, and probably have some unconscious stereotypes about who people are. So that's social capital, that it's very much about our networks, and it might be an actual relationship, like, my friend's mum or dad works for, but also it can be those social markers that confirm membership of this group called class. How is that different to cultural capital? What's cultural capital? Well,
cultural capital is more about what you know. So if social capital is who you know, cultural capital is what you know. So it's the sorts of knowledges of whatever is relevant to a particular thing that you want to be part of that help you get into that and be accepted in that world. So, for example, knowledge of things like literature, the canon of literature, for example, or you mentioned things like wine, or the right wines, or even more kind of general knowledge about the world is all part of cultural capital. And if you have a lot of cultural capital, it makes it easier for you to move in middle and upper class fields in those circles and be accepted. And so a lack of cultural capital makes it much harder for people to be accepted into those circles.
So is that why parents are always, or at least middle class parents are always trying to drill table manners into the kids, and that, fork in your left hand, knife in your right?
That's right, which would be an example of embodied cultural capital.
Embodied. Yeah. So there's
manners.
Different types within cultural
there
capital.
There are. So embodied cultural capital is what you said. It's the more kind of physical markers of class, if you like. So things like manners, or the way you hold yourself. There's also a gendered aspect, things like being ladylike, for example. And on the opposite side of that, if you're considered to be uncouth, maybe because of the way you talk, maybe your accent, it sounds too rough, you don't have the right tones. Those sorts of markers of class, and they can be really physical as well. It can be things like your teeth. You haven't had access to good dental care, so you have what we call in London dodgy railings. So those kinds of things mark your class and make it again harder for working class people to move in those middle and upper class circles, and therefore can be excluded from those particular fields.
And I guess the more that you practice those, and kind of, we have muscle memory as well as mind memory. So if you walk into a room or a restaurant and you're faced with that full formal dining setting with 3 or 4 different types of cutlery lined up outside and 3 different glasses, if you don't show any kind of nervousness in your body, then you're kind of demonstrating that your sense of belonging in...
Absolutely, and it might seem arbitrary that you know which fork to use, and of course it really is, but for the working class person in that middle or upper class field, it makes them feel quite insecure, and they might lack confidence, and they might withdraw themselves from the situation, and so that might not be eating dinner somewhere, it might be in their workplace or at university. It does definitely have a big effect on students coming to university.
So again, this translation of cultural capital into economic capital.
That's right, yeah.
Middle class kids feel way more comfortable at university.
Yes,
that this is where they belong. Whereas first in family and working class kids really have to build that sense of belonging.
Yeah, and sometimes feel very out of place. I'll give you an example from my own experience going into university for the first time as a mature age student. So growing up working class, we did have books in the house. My dad liked to read spy thrillers. My mum, when she had time, she would read historical romances. So reading was normal. So we all read, and we would choose all sorts of things to read. But I didn't realise until I got to university that I'd been reading the wrong things. I was like, wrong. So when I got into my first classes and the lecturers were talking about the great literature, the canon of literature, all the dead white men that you've already mentioned earlier, I think, I didn't know who they were. And I realised that other students did. And so when the lecturers were talking about these works, I felt really out of place. It meant I lost any sort of confidence I might have had and withdrew to think about maybe I shouldn't be here, maybe this is not for me. And that's a very common experience. Now I managed to overcome that in my own kind of way, but for a lot of students that's a very difficult thing to overcome. And I still don't ever feel really part of that. I still feel on the outside. But now I've learned to celebrate what I do know.
And which takes quite a lot of confidence.
That's right, and you know, a bit of age, because I'm quite old now. So it comes with age.
So that's embodied cultural capital. What other types of cultural capital?
Yeah, so there's objectified cultural capital, which is kind of the stuff, I suppose, the material possessions. So having having the bits and pieces that help to mark your class. So having the status symbols, you could say.
Yeah.
Now there is a little bit of things have changed since Bourdieu's time, so there's a little bit of a shift there because there are some, you talked about this before, some brands that have become more associated with working class culture, even though they were high-end brands,
right.
such as Burberry in the UK. But yeah, those material markers, the material possessions, which do signify class as well, having the fine things.
So you know, probably the iPhone is, you know, a critical kind of marker of
that's
this,
right. That's right. Yeah.
University. Or which computer are you working on? A MacBook Air or a clunky, thick, PC thing? It both function, both do the task, but they're kind of indicators.
They do have, and even
meaning,
the sorts of internet
money,
that you have now for our students, whether they have access to high-speed internet or not, that can make a difference as well.
Yeah.
And the car you drive and all that sort of stuff.
So that's objectified cultural capital, all the material possessions that are an indicator of class. What's the third part of cultural capital?
So that would be the institutionalised cultural capital. So that relates to very much to that what you know, but then how you got it as well. So your qualifications, that formal education, the degrees that you might have acquired at university, and not even just the degree, but where you got it from as well. So the particular institutions. So, for some, I think it does apply here in Australia. It's probably a little bit more marked in the UK and the United States. If you've got a degree from Oxford or Cambridge, for example, or Princeton or Harvard. Here it might be Sydney University. At UTS we would not say so, of course. But that sort of suggestion or connotation that the actual institution that's provided you, awarded that degree, gives you more capital.
And actually the law degree is a really good example of that. So that example I was telling you about Mark lawyers, where they found that they actually employed people from the non-elite universities more once they weren't allowed to know where the degree comes from. All law degrees have to be accredited by the Law Council, so they actually all have to meet a certain threshold, and yet there's this enormous distinction or hierarchy even between which institution you got your law degree from.
I mean, you could describe that as snobbery, but snobbery in itself doesn't seem that important, but it has implications because it can lead to not being employed or offered an internship.
Yes.
So even though people say, snobbery, that's not nice, we won't do that, it actually does translate into a real practical kind of impact and effect.
And which can either keep you in your place, and in fact more commonly will keep you in your place, or at least will, even if you can move, so you're the first in the family to go to university, so you're going to get a degree, you're going to, while you're here, learn all that embodied cultural capital, because you're going to have a new field that we won't go into, another Bourdieu term, but you're going to have another field in which you feel comfortable and at home. But nonetheless, there's a limit to how far you can.
Absolutely, and it's partly based on your own understanding or awareness of your lack of cultural capital, but then also based on the way you're perceived by those who have the cultural capital. So it works both ways, and that can be quite difficult. So even if you are feeling, okay, I know this, I can do this, when you move in those areas, you might lose all that confidence because of the way you're treated or received by those at the, on the other side.
And we're looking at tiny little micro embodiments of confidence or not, or of really tiny little faux pas that can kind of give the game away.
Well, like mispronouncing words, like I did earlier on. It's something that those of us growing up working class without access to a great deal of literature and so on, or academic works, don't know how to pronounce words. So we might be able to read them and understand them, but when we go to say them, we say them incorrectly. And of course people make fun of that. So I've learned to just embrace that now if I say something.
And make it humorous.
But for some people that makes them very anxious.
Yes.
And that sort of can stop them from doing the things that they want to do.
And indeed, I don't like it when we have to do French theorists, because that exposes the limit of my cultural capital.
That's right, because speaking French is considered to be, which is interesting in itself, because the idea that some languages have cultural capital and some don't. There are, being bilingual in English and French is considered to be an asset, but being bilingual in, say, English and Arabic is considered a deficit or a lack. So that's a whole other linguistic capital. But Bourdieu himself was working class. He came from a rural town in France, and that's why he was so aware of how class worked.
But he went to one of the top universities in France.
And that's just sharpened his perception of how these things work, having come from his father was a postman, I think.
Yes, I did read that. That's, absolutely fascinating. Okay, so I think that's probably enough Bourdieu for first years.
You can never get too much Bourdieu.
No, that is very true. We both love Bourdieu. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks for listening. Good luck.